The winter that proved her right came without warning, the way winters in that valley always did, arriving not with a slow gray settle but all at once, a wall of weather rolling down from the north ridges on the third day of February, 1890, and piling snow against every door and window until the doors would not open and the windows were blind with white. That was the winter people in that country would talk about for 30 years afterward, the winter that killed livestock in their stalls and froze the well ropes solid to the pulley and sent men and women stumbling from their houses toward whatever light they could find. And in the middle of that valley, on 38 acres that nobody had wanted and a few people had openly laughed at, Glenn Reynolds had already been 60 feet underground for the better part of 2 years, and the ground that everyone called her folly was the only warm place left in 4 square miles. She had not planned it as a refuge. She had planned it as a living. Before any of that, though, there was the morning she learned the land was gone. It was October of 1888, and she was 24 years old. And she found out the way a person finds out about most things that have already been decided without them, from a piece of paper, rather than a face. Her brother, Calhoun, had left the deed transfer notice on the kitchen table, folded once, weighted under the salt cellar, as though the salt cellar made it official, or made it easier, or made it anything other than what it was. The timber outfit had paid $420 for 160 acres of mountain territory land, and the deed was signed, and the land was gone. Glenn read it twice. She set it back under the salt cellar. She went outside and stood in the yard where her father had stood for the better part of 40 years, and she looked at the ridge to the north, and the creek line to the south, and the back quarter to the east where the old shaft was, and she did not cry, because crying would not have changed the arithmetic. Her father, Emrys Reynolds, had come from a valley in South Wales where the men learned to read rock the way other men learned to read letters, and he had brought that knowledge across an ocean and up into the mountain territories of the American West, and spent the last 20 years of his life trying to teach it to whoever would sit still long enough to learn. Calhoun had not sat still. Ward, the younger one, had sat still only long enough to determine that the knowledge was not immediately convertible to money, which in Ward's view disqualified it. Glenn had sat still. Glenn had sat still for years, through the evenings after supper, when her father drew the quartz formations on the back of the envelope paper with a stub of pencil, through the cold mornings when he showed her how to listen to the change in a hammer's ring when it struck honest rock versus hollow ground, through the long summers when he let her help him timber the shaft walls, showing her how to set a cap piece and a leg post so that 60 feet of earth above you became something you had accounted for, rather than something waiting to kill you. He had died in the spring of 1887, a month after her 23rd birthday, of a lung complaint that had been growing in him for a decade. He left her almost nothing that the law would recognize as property. He left her the knowledge in her hands and a battered field notebook, its covers worn dark with the oils of his palms, filled with sketches and measurements and notations in his cramped Welsh-inflected hand. And he had left, though she had not known it yet, one other thing: the original patent filing for the mine claim on the back quarter, a document he had filed years before with the county, which reserved the subsurface rights to that 38 acres separately from the surface deed, so that even if the surface land passed to other hands, what was below it was his, and after him hers. She did not know that in October of 1888. She knew only that her brothers had sold the land and that she was still standing in the yard. Calhoun came out of the house an hour later and told her she had 30 days to find other arrangements. He said it the way he said most things, with a kind of flat practical efficiency, as though the conversation were a fence post that needed to go in, and the sooner it went in, the better for everyone. He was not a cruel man, precisely, He was a man who had inherited the habit of deciding without asking, the way some men inherit a watch or a coat, and who had never been made to see the cost of it. Ward did not say anything to her directly. Ward let Calhoun do the saying. Glenn told them she was staying on the back quarter. Calhoun looked at her the way a man looks at weather he cannot immediately account for. He said the back quarter was rocky ground, no good for cattle, too far from the creek to farm. She told him she was aware of what it was good for. She moved her belongings to the small shed at the edge of the back quarter that her father had used for tool storage. She set her father's field notebook on the shelf above the workbench. She led Patch, the gray mule who had been her father's before he was hers, across the yard and into the lean-to that adjoined the shed. And Patch stood in the lean-to and regarded her with the particular expression of a mule who has strong opinions about the adequacy of accommodations, but who will, under protest, remain. The old shaft was 30 feet deep when she went back into it the first time, timbered in her father's careful style down to about 20 feet, and open bare rock below that. Her father had worked it intermittently for years, following a narrow vein that had given out at 18 feet, and then, lower down, showed hints of a second formation, a quartz seam that ran at an angle to the surface. The kind of formation her father had described to her as patient, meaning it rewarded the miner who kept going when the obvious signs had gone cold. She began deepening the shaft in November of 1888, working alone with a hand drill and a single jackhammer and a small charge of black powder for the stubborn sections, hauling the muck out in a canvas bucket hitched to Patch. It was slow work. It was cold work. The temperature underground held steady at a few degrees above freezing, even in the worst of winter, which was warmer than the shed. So she worked as long as the light lasted, and sometimes longer by lantern, her breath misting in the yellow light, the hammer ringing clean on the drill steel, the rock coming out in chunks that she examined each time before she set them aside. If you have ever seen someone work who truly knows what they are doing, you understand that there is a quality to the motion, a kind of settled economy, that is different from the motion of someone who is simply laboring. Glenn Reynolds worked that way. She did not hurry. She did not waste. Each drill hole went where the rock told her it should go, and when she set a charge, she set it where the formation required it. And when she timbered the new section, she set the cap pieces and leg posts the way her father had shown her, fitting them to the exact dimensions of the opening, wedging them tight with wooden wedges driven until they rang solid, so that what she was building in the dark and the cold and the quiet was not a hole in the ground, but a room. The town of Caldwell Crossing was 3 miles north by road, which in winter could stretch to an hour's journey, and in spring mud to twice that. It had a general store run by Delia Marsh, who was a compact and energetic woman of 50, with a talent for the kind of observation that lands hardest when spoken aloud in a public place. And it had the county surveyor's office where Orrin Yates kept his records and instruments, and it had a church social hall that doubled as a meeting room and a place to form opinions about one's neighbors. It also had, as every small town does, a particular spot where those opinions received their most regular airing, which in this case was the long porch in front of Delia's store, where on dry days a rotation of men sat on nail kegs and empty crates and discussed the affairs of the valley with the authority of people who had not been asked. Glenn made the trip to Caldwell Crossing once a week for supplies through that first winter, coming in with Patch and the small flat cart, buying what she needed, exchanging as few words as possible, and returning. She was aware that she was being watched and discussed. She was not unaware that the discussion was not complimentary. She had read enough of her father's experience as a Welsh miner in an American town to understand that a woman working a mine shaft alone on 38 acres of backwater rocky ground was going to attract a quality of commentary that had nothing to do with the merits. The first time she heard it named, She was inside the store in late March of 1889, and Delia was speaking to two men by the Cracker Barrel. And Delia said, with the particular relish of a woman who has just found the right phrase for something she has been turning over for weeks, that what Glenn Reynolds was doing up on that back quarter was Reynolds's folly. Because what else would you call a girl who sold herself into a hole in the ground rather than find a decent situation? The men laughed. One of them was Ward, her own brother, who laughed the loudest of all three, as though the laughter let him off some hook he didn't want to examine. Glenn bought her flour and her lamp oil and her drill steel, and she set them in the cart, and she drove Patch back up the road, and the only concession she made to what she had heard was that she worked an extra 2 hours that night before she came up. If you find yourself partial to this story, as I hope you do, I will ask you to stay with it, because the part that matters most is still coming, and it is worth the wait. By the summer of 1889, she was 40 feet down, and the quartz seam had become undeniable. It appeared first as a pale, suggestive line in the gray country rock, no thicker than her thumb. But when she held her lantern close and ran her finger along it, she could feel the crystal structure, the faint glitter that her father had described to her as the rock's way of showing its hand. She did not get excited in the way that a person who had not spent years watching her father work might have gotten excited. She got careful instead. She took out his field notebook and she made her measurements, noting the angle of the seam, its width, the character of the surrounding rock, and she wrote it all down in the same cramped notation her father had used, because the notebook was her record of what was true, and what was true needed to be preserved, whether anyone else believed it or not. The seam widened at 45 feet to a width she could span with both hands, and it ran at a southwesterly angle that her father's notes, in a passage she had read so many times the corner of the page had gone soft, described as the classic orientation of productive quartz formations in this particular range of mountains. She chipped a sample loose, examined it in the lantern light, and set it on the shelf above the workbench next to the field notebook. She continued deepening the shaft. By the time the valley's first real cold arrived in November of 1889, she was 60 feet down, the shaft fully timbered from collar to face, the seam running wide and consistent along the east wall. She had a small iron stove in the shed above, and a woodpile that she had spent August and September building into something that could outlast a serious winter, and Patch in the lean-to with good hay, and a blanket when the temperature dropped. She had $20 saved in a tin box under the workbench, and she had the vein, and she had the notebook, and she had the knowledge in her hands. Delia used the phrase Reynolds's folly 3 more times that autumn that Glenn knew of, twice on the store porch and once inside, at the church social in October, where she said it to a cluster of women with the cheerful specificity of someone who has been waiting for an audience worthy of the material. Ward still laughed. Calhoun, when told about it secondhand, said nothing, and his silence had by that point become a kind of statement in its own right, neither endorsement nor objection, the silence of a man who had made a decision and found it more comfortable not to look at it too directly. There was one person in the valley who did not laugh. Cora Fenwick farmed a place a little less than a mile east of Glenn's back quarter, a widow of 31 with 2 children, a boy of 9 named James and a girl of 7 named Ada, and she had lost her husband to a horse accident 2 years before and had kept the farm running since on a combination of stubbornness and neighbor help that was, in the unspoken accounting of rural communities, already beginning to run short. Cora had walked over one afternoon in the summer of 1889 and stood at the edge of Glenn's yard and watched Glenn working at the collar of the shaft for a while, and then she had called out and asked if she could come closer, and Glenn had said yes, and Cora had come and looked down into the shaft where the lantern light showed the timbering and the pale vein along the east wall. and she had said simply that Glenn's father had built the timbers like a man who cared about the work. Glenn had looked at her for a moment and said that he had. They did not talk much after that, but Cora walked over sometimes in the evenings and sat on an upturned bucket near the shed door, while Glenn worked at the bench, and neither of them required conversation to make the company useful. The blizzard came on February 3rd, 1890, a Tuesday. Glenn knew it was coming before it arrived. The same way her father had taught her to know things underground, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of them. The color of the sky at dawn, a greenish yellow she had seen described in his notebook, the behavior of Patch, who began pressing against the back wall of the lean-to and refused his grain the morning before the weather turned, and the sound of the wind in the north ridges, a particular tone in the higher registers that her father had called the valley's warning voice. She brought in extra wood that afternoon. She brought Patch's hay inside the shed. She filled every vessel she had with water from the creek, because she knew that by the next morning the creek would be ice from bank to bank. The snow started at dusk, and it did not stop. By the morning of the second day, the road to Caldwell Crossing was gone, meaning not blocked, but simply gone, replaced by an unbroken white that gave no indication there had ever been a road. The temperature dropped through the morning and kept dropping. Glenn measured it as best she could against the old mercury thermometer her father had hung on the shed wall, and by the afternoon of the second day it stood at 12 below zero and falling, and the sound the snow made against the shed walls had changed from a whisper to a press, a steady building weight that she could hear in the way the timbers creaked. On the fourth day, in the early afternoon, she heard Patch make a sound she had not heard him make before, a sharp, high note of attention rather than complaint, and she came out of the shaft and found Cora at the shed door, with James and Ada behind her, the three of them covered in snow to the waist, their faces the color of old candle wax. Cora had James by the wrist and Ada pressed against her side, and she said, with the brevity of a person who has spent the last 4 hours in extreme cold and has very little voice left, that the roof of her house had gone. Glenn did not say anything. She opened the shed door wider and she took Ada from Cora's arm, and she carried the girl inside. She went back for James. She made Cora sit on the bench nearest the iron stove, and she put the children on the blanket that served as her bedroll, and she added wood to the stove, and she went to the shaft collar and dropped the access ladder, and she said they were going down. Cora looked at the shaft opening. Glenn said the shaft held 60 feet of constant temperature, several degrees above freezing, fully timbered, no wind, and that she had enough lamp oil for 3 weeks. Cora picked up Ada and went down the ladder. They established themselves on the floor of the shaft, where Glenn had laid planking along one wall to keep gear off the bare rock, and which now served as a surface wide enough for the children to sleep on. She hung 2 lanterns, one at the midpoint of the shaft and one near the face, and their light filled the timbered space with a yellow warmth that was something between practical and consoling. The vein ran along the east wall above them, pale and crystalline and patient, and the temperature underground was steady at perhaps 4 degrees above freezing, which after the surface air felt to all of them like standing inside a house with a good fire. Cora's children slept most of the first day, the sleep of bodies that have been running on cold and fear, and have used up both. Glenn fed them dried beans cooked over a small fire she built at the shaft bottom, using the ventilation she had constructed when she timbered the upper section, a design detail her father had shown her, a short, horizontal drift at the 40-foot level that allowed air to move without letting weather in, so that a small cooking fire did not choke them. The smoke rose in a thin column and disappeared into the rock, and the beans cooked, and the 4 of them ate in the yellow lamplight with the quartz vein glittering above their heads. On the 5th day underground, James looked at the vein for a long time and asked what it was. Glenn told him it was quartz, and that inside the quartz, if you looked at the right angle in the right light, you could see the color that meant the rock was paying. The boy looked at it for another moment and said it looked like the inside of a cloud. Glenn considered that. She said she supposed it did. On the 14th day of the blizzard, the temperature outside had dropped to 31 degrees below zero, the worst it had been, and the cold was not a thing you described so much as a thing you moved through when you had to, like water at a current. Glenn went to the surface twice a day to tend Patch and to take the temperature reading and to clear the air vent of snow. And each time she came back down, her clothing held the cold in its fibers for an hour before the shaft's constant warmth reached it. The children had stopped noticing the routine. Cora helped with the cooking and kept a watch on the lanterns and had at some point taken the field notebook from its shelf and begun reading it with the careful attention of someone encountering a language they do not speak, but recognize as worth learning. On the afternoon of the 14th day, Patch made his alert sound again. Glenn climbed to the surface, and there was Calhoun, standing in the snow at the shaft collar, his coat inadequate for the conditions, his lips the pale grayish color that means the cold has been at a man for longer than is good for him. He was looking at the shaft opening. He had walked the 3 miles from the house that the timber outfit had been using, the house he had sold along with the land, and whose chimney had lost its clay liner in the first week of the blizzard, so that the fire had become a hazard worse than the cold. And he had come, on the 14th day of a 19-day blizzard, at 31 below, to the only place left. Glenn looked at him. He did not say anything for a moment. His breath was coming short, and his hands were inside his coat. She said, "Come down." He went down the ladder ahead of her, moving carefully, one rung at a time, and when he reached the floor of the shaft and the lantern light fell on him properly, Cora and the children saw him, and the children looked at Glenn, and she told them it was all right. She handed Calhoun the tin cup with the last of the morning's coffee, cold by then but above freezing, and he held it in both hands and did not drink it immediately, only held it. He stood in the shaft for a long time, and he looked at the timbering, her timbering, the cap pieces and the leg posts set in her father's style, the planking along the wall, the ventilation drift, the lanterns hung on their iron hooks, the quartz vein running wide and consistent above their heads. He had the look of a man revising something he had taken for settled, which in Calhoun's face was a notable thing, because his face generally worked hard not to revise anything at all. He said quietly that she had built this right. That was all he said. It was, given everything that had preceded it, enough. They stayed underground for 5 more days, the 5 of them, until the temperature climbed back above zero, and the snow stopped, and the wind died, and the world above them became something a person could stand in again. Glenn went up first on the 19th day and stood at the shaft collar and looked at the valley, white and still and scoured clean, and counted what she could see. 3 farms with collapsed outbuildings, 2 others with entire roof sections gone, a line of dead cattle at the Whitmore place visible from the Ridge Road, 8 of them, lying in a row where they had pressed against the fence and frozen standing and then fallen. The road to Caldwell Crossing was passable by afternoon. She helped the children up the ladder first, then Cora, then Calhoun. She came up last, and she stood in the yard of her back quarter, and she looked at the shed, which had held, and the lean-to, where Patch was standing with his ears forward, and his expression indicating that 19 days of increased proximity to humans had not improved his opinion of them, and the shaft collar and the ridge behind it, and she felt something that was less like triumph and more like the specific satisfaction of a person who did what they said they would do, and can now account for it honestly. Delia Marsh came up the road the next morning, pulled by curiosity or community conscience, or some mixture of the two. And she stood in the yard of Glenn's back quarter, and she saw Calhoun and Cora and the two children there, all of them alive. And she saw the shaft collar and the shed and the woodpile that had lasted. And she stood for a moment without speaking. Then she said in a voice that had lost its particular carrying quality, "Glenn." Not Reynolds's Folly, not a phrase at all. Just the name, spoken plainly, the way you speak a name when you have been wrong about the person who owns it. Ward came 2 days later and stood at a greater distance and said less. Ward's silence at the close was a different kind than Calhoun's silence had been throughout. Where Calhoun's had been the silence of a man avoiding an accounting, Ward's was now the silence of a man who had completed one. Orrin Yates came in the first week of March when the roads were open enough for his horse and his instrument case, and he brought with him a copy of the original patent filing that Glenn's father had submitted to the county recorder years before, which Yates had located in the county archive when Glenn had written to him in the autumn of 1889, asking whether such a document existed. He was a careful, methodical man, the surveyor, and he had spent an afternoon with the patent and the deed of sale and the legal descriptions before he came to see her. And what he told her, standing in the shed with the field notebook open on the bench, was that the subsurface rights to the 38 acres had been reserved in the original patent filing and had not passed with the surface deed when her brothers sold the land to the timber outfit. The shaft, the vein, the 38 acres below the frost line, none of it had ever been sold because her father had made certain it couldn't be. He had filed the paperwork years before he died, and he had not mentioned it to Calhoun or Ward, and he had not mentioned it to Glenn either, perhaps because he trusted her to find her way to it, or perhaps because he understood that some inheritances are worth more when they arrive as confirmation rather than instruction. Yates surveyed the vein that same week, examining the seam at several depths, taking samples, making the measurements that would support a formal assay. The assay came back in April and put the value of the quartz at approximately $42 a ton, which was consistent with silver and gold-bearing quartz in that range of mountains. He filed Glenn's claim with the county recorder and handed her the documentation in a brown paper envelope and shook her hand with both of his, a gesture she received without particular ceremony because she had already known what the vein was worth, and the paper only said out loud what the rock had been saying for 2 years. She worked the claim through the spring and summer of 1890 with the same unhurried method she had used to find it. She hired no one that first year, preferring to understand the vein's character before she brought other hands to it, and she brought out enough ore in those first months to clear the $20 in the tin box to something closer to $200, which was enough to replace the shed with a proper cabin and to put a real roof over Patch's lean-to, and to buy the good drill steel she had been postponing. She did not buy extravagant things. She bought what the work required, which was her father's way and had become her own. Cora came to work with her in the fall of 1890, having made arrangements for her farm that gave her 2 days a week free, and Glenn began teaching her the way her father had taught Glenn, not from a book, or not only from a book, but from the rock itself, showing her how to hold the drill, how to listen for the change in the hammer's ring, how to read the seam's angle, and predict where it would widen or narrow. Cora learned with the focused patience of a woman who has spent 2 years keeping a farm running alone, and knows the difference between knowledge that holds and knowledge that doesn't. James came along sometimes on those days, the boy who had said the vein looked like the inside of a cloud, and Glenn let him help with the lighter surface work. And she showed him the field notebook and explained the notation system. And he asked questions that were more precise than she had expected from a 9-year-old, which his mother received with a pride she kept carefully contained. Calhoun came in the spring of 1891, and he stood at the shaft collar again, and this time he asked if he could learn the timbering. He meant it plainly and without performance, the way a man asks for something he knows he has not earned the right to ask for easily. Glenn looked at him for a moment, and then she handed him a cap piece and a leg post, and she showed him where they went and how to set them. He was not a quick learner. He had spent too many years not sitting still. He had to be shown the same step several times before it settled in his hands, and there were moments where Glenn could see him struggling against the habit of assuming he already understood. She did not comment on that. She showed him again. He got it eventually. The knowledge took root in him the way knowledge does when a person stops arguing with it, slowly and then solidly, and what he built under her direction held what it was supposed to hold. Word moved through the valley the way word does in country where news travels slowly, and therefore travels far. And by the end of 1891, there were 2 other mining operations in that range of mountains that had sent men to speak with Glenn Reynolds about timbering methods, and she had spoken with them, showing them her father's notation system and explaining the ventilation design that had made the shaft survivable in the blizzard. One of those men took the notebook pages she had drawn for him and carried them to a mining engineer in the county seat who was writing a report on small operator methods, and Glenn's shaft design appeared in that report as an example of sound single-family practice, described with the clinical admiration of a professional encountering good work done by someone he had not expected to know how to do it. She did not read the report until it was several years old. When she did, she noted that her father's name was not in it, and her name was given only as the operator. But the methods were recorded accurately, and that was what her father would have cared about, the recording of the method, rather than the credit, because the method was the thing that would keep working after the person who devised it was gone. Patch lived to be 31 years old, which is older than most mules, and considerably older than anyone who was not paying close attention would have predicted. In his later years, he moved slowly and required assistance with the gradient sections of the path up to the shaft collar, assistance that Glenn provided without remark, the same way Patch had provided assistance with the muck bucket through the long digging winters without remark. He was working the back quarter the year the first consistent yield came in, and he was working it still, at reduced capacity and with strong personal opinions about the schedule. The year Cora's daughter Ada turned 15 and came to learn the timbering herself. The valley changed slowly in the years after the blizzard, the way valleys change when a catastrophe has done the work of deciding questions that the community's comfortable habit could not. The timber outfit that had bought the surface of Glenn's 160 acres worked it for 6 years and then moved on, as timber outfits did, and the land reverted to the county for back taxes, and no one bought it for some time, and the trees began their slow return on the slopes above the creek. The mine shaft in the back quarter remained exactly as Glenn had timbered it, and the vein remained consistent at $42 a ton through the end of the decade, modest but steady, the kind of claim that did not make a person rich in one season, but did not quit in a bad one either. Delia Marsh ran her store for another 12 years and never used the phrase Reynolds's folly again, not because she was ashamed of it precisely, but because the events of February 1890 had performed a kind of permanent reclassification. And when she spoke of Glenn now, she spoke of her the way people speak of someone who has made a fact of themselves, which requires no modifier and no interpretation. The only thing Delia ever said about it directly was, one afternoon in the store in the spring of 1892, when a man passing through asked her who owned the claim on the back quarter, and she told him Glenn Reynolds did, and he asked what kind of operation it was, and Delia, without particular drama, said it was a sound one. That was the whole of what she said, and it carried in its restraint the full weight of everything she had not said in the preceding 4 years. The field notebook lasted longer than anyone who handled it would have predicted for a thing made of paper and cheap binding glue, and the accumulated oils of 2 pairs of working hands. Glenn kept it on the shelf above the workbench in the cabin that replaced the shed, and she added to it in her own hand as the years passed, noting the vein's character at new depths, recording the assay figures, sketching the modifications she made to the timbering design as the shaft went deeper. The sketches blended with her father's without a visible seam, his cramped Welsh notation alongside her slightly larger American hand, so that what you held when you held it was not a record of one person's knowledge, but of two. The knowledge passed from hand to hand across the distance of death and distance, which is what knowledge does when it is properly cared for. She taught Cora to read the notebook. She taught James and then Ada, and then 2 young men from the operations that had come to ask about the timbering, and later a girl from the next valley who had heard about the blizzard through the kind of community memory that grows more accurate rather than less as time passes, because the people who survived it remembered it exactly, and told it exactly, and did not improve it with embellishment, because it did not need any. By the end of the century, a decade after the blizzard, the timbering method that Glenn Reynolds had adapted from her father's Welsh mining practice and refined through 2 years of single-handed underground work in a 38-acre backquarter that nobody had wanted was in use at a dozen small operations across that range of mountains. None of the operators who used it knew the whole of its history. Some of them knew the name. Most of them knew only that it was the method that worked, which was the only designation her father would have recognized as worth having. In the spring of 1901, on a morning when the light came in, flat and clean across the ridge, and the air was the particular freshness that follows a cold night in high country, Glenn Reynolds stood at the collar of her shaft, 60 feet and then some below her, timbered along its full depth, the quartz vein wide and quiet in the wall. And she listened to the valley the way she had learned to listen to rock. Not for any one sign, but for the accumulation of them, the creek running clear, the birds in the new timber on the hillside above the old surface acres, Patch standing in his lean-to with his ears forward in the direction of the morning, still and attentive in his aged and particular way, the same way he had always stood when the ground had something to say. The ground had been saying it all along. She had only ever been required to listen,